King Arthur might not be the first guy you think of when I say The Lord of the Rings. Sure, there's superficial similarities, guys on horses and whatnot, but he's not typically the first thing that comes up when you're discussing the inspirations behind Tolkien's works. A lot of people will point to the Norse myths, like Fafnir the dragon and the man who came in and stole shiny things from his hoard, or they'll discuss Welsh, Finnish, or even the Bible. But I find that King Arthur and the knights at Camelot rarely get brought up in this conversation. This is kind of surprising, since King Arthur has been ping-ponging around the Western European imagination for over 1,000 years, but I think it makes sense because Tolkien's relationship with the Arthurian myths was incredibly nuanced. In some ways, Tolkien disavowed the Arthurian tradition completely, and that is an interesting conversation to have, and we will discuss that. But today, I want to talk about the ways in which the Arthurian myths formed the backbone of some of Tolkien's most iconic and most obscure stories. This video has been sponsored by, well, me, actually, because Hobbit Day is coming up this weekend. I thought I would give you guys a very special announcement, so stick around to the end of the video to hear that. Let's begin with a discussion of what Arthurian myth is and what it is not. What it is not is a single story. There is no one canon document from which all of the Arthurian myths have sprung. There's not even really a canon to it at all. So, what is it then? The general consensus among scholars is that the first written record of a King Arthur comes from the Historia Brittonum. It was written in the year 830 by an unknown author, and was commissioned by a Welsh king to be a complete history of the Welsh people. It mentions a King Arthur as one of many British kings, it discusses 12 different battles that he fought in, and it notes his association with certain landmarks. Now, the interesting thing is that the Historia Brittonum isn't exactly what we would consider a historical account. We don't have any evidence that the King Arthur mentioned in this story is a real person. 11 out of those 12 battles that he's said to have fought in can't be located on a map in the historical record, and the landmarks that are attributed to him, it's things like a carving of an animal's footprint in a rock, and they say that that was King Arthur's dog who left that footprint. And that's not exactly scientifically provable, but the Historia Brittonum wasn't meant to be a completely accurate historical guide. It was meant to be a recollection of the remembered history of the Welsh people. It was history not as it was, but as they told it. These were the stories that they kept for themselves, probably based on a seed of truth, but heavily embellished, if not completely fictional in some places. And that means that even in this very earliest record of King Arthur, he is more story than man. For the next few centuries, he floated around the Western European imagination, but around 1135, Geoffrey of Monmouth, a Welsh cleric, cemented him once more into literature. Geoffrey of Monmouth is credited with 3 surviving works, but his most famous one is called The History of the Kings of Britain. It writes of a King Arthur that is pious, generous, and brave, all of the ideal characteristics of a ruler. But despite all of these positive characteristics, Geoffrey of Monmouth's King Arthur still couldn't exactly be qualified as real. Just like the Historia Brittonum, the History of the Kings of Britain was not intended to be a strictly historically accurate text. Geoffrey relied mainly on his fertile imagination. Though he was careful to use accepted methods of historical reconstruction, especially etymology, and to bolster invention by including whatever facts could be garnered from earlier authorities. But historical accuracy wasn't his aim, and it wasn't what readers were looking for. The noble king he told of was a good idea. It was a useful tool to teach people about the acceptable conduct for a king, and so people accepted it as real enough. Soon after its publication, the History of the Kings of Britain was translated from Latin to vernacular, the language of the people, and its popularity only grew from there. It was translated to French, where it was rewritten in octosyllabic couplets, very fancy, and then that version was translated back into English. And through these many versions of the story, these translations, these retellings, the story flexed a lot. Elements were introduced, like the idea that Arthur was stolen at birth by the elves, and that some of his most admirable qualities came from the Fae. But at this time, that amount of changeability in a story wasn't anything out of the ordinary. Before the days of copyright, before the days of the printing press, it was generally accepted that every time a story was retold, it would change. This is especially true of the oral storytelling tradition, but it also holds for printed media. Plagiarism just wasn't really a thing, and storytellers were expected to spin tales their own way every time they told them. In the 12th century, French poets like Chrétien de Troyes took and remolded the stories, creating entire story arcs out of these scattered histories and introducing new elements which would become contemporarily familiar, such as the idea of a grail, which would eventually become the Holy Grail. Throughout the 12th century, the tale of King Arthur was growing across Europe in two different ways. One was the poetic tradition, where we would pick one character and follow their story throughout their adventures, and the other was the pseudo-historical chronicle of the king, of his life, his times, and his political ventures. But it was in the 13th century that the popularity of the Arthurian tale exploded. It became a kind of industry, authors churning out songs and poems and prose, retelling and changing the story, a singular tale told by thousands of minds over thousands of miles. One notable piece from this time was the 13th century Vulgate cycle, a piece of French literature which pieced together a lot of the disparate tales of King Arthur. It's one of the first times that we see all of these cycles, the story of King Arthur, of all of his different knights, start to interlace. They told stories that had an impact on each other. They reused characters across different stories. They chronologically worked it out and worked out where the emphasis needed to be for the next story to make sense in an interconnected manner. It was in this explosion of Arthurian storytelling in the 13th century that we get what we kind of loosely understand today as the Arthurian canon. By the 14th century, Arthur was a widely recognizable figure, considered a hero, a uniter of nations. He was, for all intents and purposes, believed to be a historical figure, but also an important element in the storytelling tradition. Probably the most iconic collection of Arthurian stories is L'Amour d'Arthur, a 15th century compilation and retelling of a lot of those older myths. In it, English writer Sir Thomas Malory sought to create the compendium of Arthurian literature, to collect everything together and tell his entire story from birth to death and all of the round table adventures in between in one cohesive story. Of course, considering that the legend had never ever been one story, this required a lot of editing and rewriting. He placed a greater emphasis on the character of Lancelot and his adventures and misadventures, and portrayed Arthur as someone kind, brave, and chivalrous. L'Amour d'Arthur would usurp Geoffrey of Monmouth's The History of the Kings of Britain as the definitive Arthurian compendium. It's still considered that today, even if the legend of Arthur has grown far past L'Amour d'Arthur. Although through the following years his popularity would wax and wane, King Arthur never really left the imagination of Western Europe, especially Britain. He was often used as a tool of propaganda by monarchs like the Tudors, but he was also seen throughout art, music, and literature as a figure of the romantic past and the pure, wholesome goodness of chivalric values. He remained simmering under the surface until the Victorian era, when he came back in style big time. English poet Alfred Tennyson played a big role in this revival. In 1833, he published his poem The Lady of Shalott, which retold a 13th century French tale in lush, rhyming verse. He continued coming back to Arthurian literature throughout his career, oftentimes rewriting these stories to fit better into the Victorian moral code, infusing them with his contemporary values. His works found widespread popularity, bolstered by a growing wave of medieval romanticism. This is where we see an explosion of medieval-inspired art, especially inspired by literary figures such as the Lady of Shalott. Inspired by Tennyson's poem, artists like J.W. Waterhouse and William Holman Hunt recreated images from his poem in lush, vibrant detail, nostalgically looking back to a imagined medieval past. This sense of medieval romanticism was really embodied by the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, a group formed in 1848 dedicated to recalling the artistic styles of the past, with a particular lean towards their imagined romantic medieval past. Especially in England, Victorian people were hanging on to this nostalgic concept of the past as a way to shield themselves from the onslaught of the future. Of course, anytime anything gets popular, people are going to dislike it. The retellings of Tennyson were mocked for their uncritical praise of monarchy and masculinity and good old-fashioned Victorian values. In 1889, Mark Twain published A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, a novel which called out the sometimes sickly romanticization of a period that was, in all reality, brutal, dangerous, and often very dark. In A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, a modern-day man is sent back into the Arthurian world of authors like Thomas Malory, and through his eyes, we're able to see just how nasty the past really could be. It's a humorous novel, but in its critique of Arthurian media, it goes to show just what a flexible tool the character of King Arthur could be. Now, around this time, as we get into the 20th century, Arthur was no longer really regarded as real. We were able to find the earliest records of him, like the Historia Brittonum, to determine that even in those earliest records, he was already a mythical figure. Of course, myths come from somewhere, so for all we know, there was totally a fella named Arthur in the year 500 who was in charge of something or someone. Literary research, on top of archaeological research, showed us that the vision of Arthur that we saw in Tennyson or Malory was not really real. But what is real is the time period that this legend was born from. For a long time, the early medieval period was written off as the Dark Ages. Folks of the Renaissance wanted to feel really fancy and clever compared to those people from the past, so they made it seem like the early medieval period was this dark and dismal time where nobody did anything good or important or said anything good or important. And although the 5th century through roughly the 10th century in Europe was, it was a tough time for everyone, and the written record is pretty hazy from this period, it wasn't all terrible. There may not have been a King Arthur and a court at Camelot, but there was still art, learning, and beauty being created in this time that we are still discovering today. And in a way, some of the credit for these discoveries can be given to King Arthur, whether or not he's real. A desire to prove these stories real or fake once and for all gave us the impetus to pull the veil off of the Dark Ages. And while we may not have found our King of Britain, we found a time that was flourishing in its own way, in the very special way that humans always do. Through the 20th century, even if the guise of historicity was gone, the Arthurian legend flourished. In fact, according to the Cambridge Companion to the Arthurian Legend, over 80% of English language Arthurian literature was written in the 20th century, particularly in its latter half. New and speedier forms of media, radio, television, film, games, allowed the collective storytelling of the Arthurian legend to flourish even more than it had in the 13th century. Whether it's retellings, compendiums, studies, or simply the use of motifs, I think you would be hard-pressed to find a single English-speaking person who hasn't at least heard the name of King Arthur. The Arthurian legend provides a complex set of symbols, motifs, and points of reference that can be appropriated by poets, novelists, filmmakers, and others with the reasonable confidence that the reference will not be lost on the audience. Among those easily recognizable features of the legend are the Holy Grail and the quest, Merlin, the sword in the stone, the love of Lancelot and Guinevere, and the possible return of the once and future king. So, that might leave you wondering, what did Tolkien think about all this? He was born at the tail end of the Victorian medievalist revival, and he loved his ancient tales and myths, so what about Arthur? Well, it's complicated. In a letter, he explained his frustration with the lack of extant ancient English myths. I was, from early days, grieved by the poverty of my own beloved country. It had no stories of its own, bound up with its tongue and soil, not of the quality that I sought and found as an ingredient in legends of other lands. Of course, there was, and is, all the Arthurian world, but powerful as it is imperfectly naturalized, associated with the soil of Britain, but not with English, and does not replace what I felt to be missing. But his unhappiness with the non-Englishness of these myths didn't mean that he didn't involve himself with them. In 1925, before The Hobbit and before The Lord of the Rings, he published his translation of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. The tale of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is a bit of an anomaly in Arthurian literature. It wasn't discovered until 1839, and we've only found one extant manuscript of it from around 1400. We know next to nothing about the author, other than that his dialect indicates he was probably raised in the Northwest Midlands, and yet this tale demonstrates a pretty comprehensive understanding of the collective Arthurian myth being told everywhere, from France to Wales and everything in between. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight tells the story of a Knight of the Round Table, Sir Gawain, who faces off against a mysterious Green Knight in a Christmas challenge. It's a story of adventure, intrigue, chivalry, and trickery, all told through Middle English verse. Tolkien's translation of this tale is really unique in the way that it maintains the original poetic integrity. In England, around the 1400s, rhyming poetry was not yet in vogue. That was a French invention. Instead, they used alliteration, starting words off with the same letter or sound. They did make use of rhyme in very specific sections, such as at the end of stanzas, when they would have a section that they called the bob and wheel. A bob is a very truncated and unnatural end to a phrase, which sets you up to go into the wheel, a set of very rhythmic rhyming lines. As an example, we see in the original text, "If ye will listen this lay, but on little while, ye shall tell hit as tit as Ian tun herda with tongue, as hit is stad and stocken, in story stiff and strong, with lel letteres loken, in Lunde so hat's been long." The bob is with tongue, a short phrase that gears our ears up to be ready for those rhyming couplets. Tolkien's translation of these same lines reads, "If you will listen to this lay but a little while now, I will tell it at once as in town I have heard it told, as it is fixed and fettered in story brave and bold, thus linked and truly lettered, as was loved in this land of old." As you can see, Tolkien very elegantly preserved both the general meaning and the form of the poetic meter. Tolkien's translation is not perfect, and it can feel a little bit clunky at times, but it stands as a testament to his understanding of both the poetic forms of this time and the type of story that he was telling. But Sir Gawain was not the only directly Arthurian tale that Tolkien retold. In the 1930s, he began work on a poem that he entitled The Fall of Arthur. It was never actually finished, but in verse it tells the tale of King Arthur, a once great military leader whose reign is now being usurped. Rebellion has come to his home, his wife has left him for one of his knights, and a knight named Mordred is coming to claim his throne. The Fall of Arthur doesn't just show Tolkien's respect for the story of King Arthur, as even he was modeling it to his taste, he still maintained a lot of the bones of the original story, but it also showed his respect for the poetic form that it was originally told in. It has been proposed that The Fall of Arthur was written, at least in part, as a response to Victorian authors like Tennyson. Tolkien wanted to strip the Victorian ideals from these tales, to rip down the flowery wallpaper, to reveal a version of that story that was more English, in his opinion, and more true. Let's just compare a few lines from the work of Tennyson and a few from Tolkien's The Fall of Arthur. Tennyson writes in The Lady of Shalott, "In the stormy east wind straining, the pale yellow woods were waning, the broad stream in his banks complaining, heavily the low sky raining over towered Camelot. Outside the isle a shallow boat beneath a willow lay afloat, below the carven stern she wrote, The Lady of Shalott." And then we have Tolkien. "As when the earth dwindles in autumn days, and soon to its setting the sun is waning under mournful mist, then a man will lust for work and wandering, while yet warm floweth blood, sun-kindled, so burned his soul after long glory, for a last essay of pride and prowess to the proof setting, will unyielding in war with fate." While both poems are good, and I really love The Lady of Shalott, Tolkien's poem is far less lyrical. It relies on alliteration rather than rhyme. Both stories are telling of a sad event, but Tolkien's is much more just outwardly bleak and morose. It's not a triumphant story of a brave ancient king, or a lush, tragic tale of a maiden slain by a curse. It is a bleak trod towards desolation. It's the Fall of Arthur. Tolkien had grown up being fed the type of fantasy that would rot your teeth if you weren't careful. The bulk of Victorian literature that was fantastical in nature was writing down to children, seeking to affirm rather than to analyze, discuss, or challenge Victorian ideals. Tolkien's The Fall of Arthur is an effort towards reclamation of what has been buried under layers of sentimentality. In The Fall of Arthur, however, we see not the eucatastrophic power and desire created by fantasy at its best, but instead the tragic manner in which oppressive ideologies, both familiar and foreign, destroy faerie through their blind appropriation of mythic symbols. To recreate these ancient tropes, to traipse through the land of Fae, to dance into war, without asking who the Fae are and why war must be, was to utterly disrespect these powerful tools of fantasy and to perpetuate misinformation. No work of art demonstrates the true power of fantasy better than Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, where we can see him recreating and dismantling many Arthurian tropes. First, and perhaps most obviously, we have the iconic wizard Gandalf. In creating Gandalf, Tolkien drew inspiration from multiple sources, especially the Norse god Odin, but he definitely took some inspiration from Merlin. Merlin of the Arthurian myths is generally portrayed as a magician or a prophet, blessed with unearthly knowledge and power. He acts as either a puppet master or a guide, often being the one to prepare Arthur for the throne. Gandalf is in a very similar vein. He has power and knowledge beyond that of most mortals, and it is his job to guide people like Frodo and Aragorn to fulfill their destinies. Merlin has become the quintessential wizard of mythology. His qualities set up the stereotypical idea of a wizard, and Tolkien uses those qualities in his creation of Gandalf. By taking on some of those other qualities of Merlin, Gandalf gains a connection to existing Celtic and Norse mythology, as well as known Arthurian legends. The one thing that Gandalf has that Merlin cannot boast of is certainty. The origins of Merlin are, due to the nature of the Arthurian myth, very scattered. Sometimes he's just a regular fella who got really smart, and sometimes he's the son of a demon. But we know who Gandalf is. We know that he is a Maiar, a spirit created before time and creation, and sent into that creation to guide humanity towards the good. Tolkien encoded Gandalf with all of the qualities of Merlin that he needed to, all of the recognizable tropes, so that we would know this character before he's even said a line, but he set Gandalf into the framework of his highly Christian world, and he provided the certainty in his story that Merlin never could. But Tolkien wasn't just distilling myths. In some cases, he was revising them entirely. Aragorn, like King Arthur, is destined for the throne by both blood and prophecy. Arthur is the son of Uther Pendragon, the next heir for the throne, even if he has been lost, just as Aragorn is lost, but is also next in the bloodline. But both of them are unable to come into their own and claim their throne until they fulfill a prophecy that involves a sword. For Arthur, this sword is Excalibur, buried to the hilt in an anvil atop a stone. His prophecy reads, "Whoso pulleth out this sword of this stone and anvil is rightwise king born of all England." Comparatively, Aragorn's prophecy says, "From the ashes a fire shall be woken, a light from the shadow shall spring, renewed shall be blade that was broken, and the crownless again shall be king." Aragorn and Arthur have a very similar path towards kingship. They are destined by blood to take the throne, but their journey is more complicated. They have to prove themselves first. And in both stories, they ascend to the kingship to return order to their disordered kingdoms. Despite these similarities, though, these characters really diverge in terms of how they rule. Obviously, there's no one set version of Arthur's story that I can reference here, but it's generally accepted that even after he became king, he continued to struggle. There was still conflict, he struggled with his wife's infidelity with one of his knights. He remained a king at war through most of the rest of his reign. Meanwhile, Aragorn settled into kingship with a humble brilliance. He took up the role of healer and healed all men, guiding us into the next age with gentle hands, with his faithful wife Arwen at his side. Aragorn understands that there are better things than glory on the battlefield, and although he has power within him, he is not the ultimate power, and it is his role to be a servant to his people. Tolkien admired the knights of the old days, the good old-fashioned chivalry and bravery, but his experiences in both of the world wars embittered him to that kind of pursuit of glory. The Arthurian king, as he's presented in his heyday, would not have been suitable for what the modern world needed in a ruler, but Aragorn, gentle, humble, and healing, is exactly what they needed. Tolkien's interactions with Arthurian myth show the way that he was able to respect ancient traditions, ancient character tropes, while still updating them to fit his modern values. Take, for example, Tolkien's island of Avalone, the first shining piece of land that you would see in your passage to Valinor. Valinor is the land of the gods in Arda, the special place where the elves are able to live immortally, and where special mortals, like Frodo and Bilbo, are able to find eternal rest. Just by the name alone, I think we can see that Avalone is clearly a nod to Avalon, the enchanted island just off the shores of England, where Arthur is brought to be healed after a battle, and in some versions of the story, it's also where he dies and is buried. The powers of Avalon are enchanting, but they are sometimes benign and sometimes tricky. And with places like Avalon, Tolkien says one way or another, whether it's good or bad, and he also explains where that power came from. He maintains the format of the old legends, the enchanted shining island just off the shore, but he reformats them to be clearer and to fit into his Christian worldview. The Christianity involved in the Arthurian myths seemed to be a bit of a sticking point for Tolkien. He explains that his aversion to Arthurian myths doesn't just come from the fact that they're very scattered and confusing and conflicting, and the fact that they're not English enough. Their clumsy integration of religion, especially his religion of Christianity, really bothered him. The Arthurian world is involved in and explicitly contains the Christian religion. For reasons which I will not elaborate, that seems to me fatal. Myth and fairy story must, as all art, reflect and contain in solution elements of moral and religious truth or error, but not explicit, not in the known form of the primary, real world. The inclusion of explicit Christianity left the Arthurian myths theologically messy. Take, for instance, the idea of the Grail. At one point, when it was first introduced to the story, this grail wasn't a relic at all. It wasn't holy, it was just an enchanted drinking vessel. It wasn't until the 12th or 13th century that a French poet introduced the idea that this grail was the Holy Grail, the one that Christ had at the Last Supper, and apparently the one where Joseph of Arimathea collected the blood of Christ crucified. This is a neat idea. I mean, most of Europe was Christian at this point, so it's kind of a way to get everybody on board and interconnected with the story you're telling, but the theological implications are they're just so messy. If this is Christ's Grail, you have to first of all explain why it wasn't explicitly mentioned in the Bible, even though it was super important, and then you have to explain how it got to England, why it still has supernatural power, and then also why Arthur, who is, even by a generous estimate, just kind of a sort of holy guy, why it is his and why it should be his. Because Christianity exists in the world of Arthurian myth, you have to explain how magic and God can interact and coexist, because magic is real in this world. You have to start asking questions about whether Merlin is holy and divinely blessed by God, or if he's demon spawn. By trying to force explicit Christianity into the framework of fantasy, especially in the kind of clumsy way that a lot of Arthurian tales did, you end up making the religion part of the fantasy, and I think it devalues it. And although Tolkien never said outright what his problem with the inclusion of explicit and clear real Christian faith in the world of Arthur, I would expect that this is at least part of the problem. It's why he didn't like that C.S. Lewis included Father Christmas in Narnia. The theology of it is just, it's messy. That's kind of the best word for it. Part of this problem, I think, definitely stems from us looking back on these stories from our 20th or 21st century perspective. Before science came in and made us think that we could actually seriously figure out how everything in the universe works, we were much more okay with a little bit of uncertainty. In the medieval period, the lines between magic, science, and religion were much softer. Thinkers, theologians, and scientists were not necessarily forced into boxes to decide which one of those three things is the right way to view the world. There was a greater acceptance of the limitations of human understanding, of the sometimes completely inexplicable workings of the world. And through this lens, it's easy to see why there was such a blending of myth, religion, and history in those Arthurian works. And this wasn't just foolish, this was beautiful. They truly understood just how powerful stories could be. Myth resonates with the core of what it means to be human. It converses with the transcendent nature of God and the incarnation. Myth is at the heart of reality and truth because it surpasses rational thought. Rather than dismissing myth as the pre-scientific groping of people who are attempting to explain natural phenomena, Tolkien saw it as a valuable way to gain insights about the nature of things at the intuitive and imaginative level. And yet, from his modern vantage point, Tolkien was able to see how confusing it was for modern readers to be faced with this blending of fiction and reality. That's why his Middle-earth contains no direct Christian elements. There's no fella named Jesus walking around. Father Christmas doesn't pop in for a visit. Instead, his world is lovingly shaped around his faith, baked into the very bones of Arda. The Lord of the Rings is, as he said, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, but he did that not obviously like the Arthurian myths, but implicitly, in a way that he thought would be much more digestible for modern audiences. The power of Tolkien's works comes from how deeply he understood what he was referencing, what he was building off of, what he was referring to. He understood it enough to not just pick the superficial elements off and use them, but to see the how and why these stories were originally told. This means that his work is so rarely derivative and is instead transformative. But I think that one of the most lasting impacts of the Arthurian myth on the work of Tolkien was just in the way that it was told. Just as it would be wrong to try and say that the Arthurian myths are one story written by one author in one book, so I think that it's wrong to claim that The Lord of the Rings isn't part of this larger storytelling tradition. In his essay on fairy stories, you can go ahead and take a shot if you're marathoning my videos, and that's the third time I've mentioned on fairy stories today, but in it, Tolkien talks about the cauldron of story. Stories are not a singular thing, a single event that ends when the echoes of the storyteller's voice die out. Rather, stories are a slow bubbling collective stew of imagination, a shared mind reaching across land, across space, and across time. The Arthurian myths are a beautiful example of this. It seems fairly plain that Arthur, once historical, but perhaps as such not of great importance, was also put into the pot. There he was boiled for a long time, together with many other older figures and devices of mythology and fairy, and even some other stray bones of history, until he emerged as a king of fairy. These traditions contain a singularly suggestive example of the relation of the fairy tale element to gods and kings and nameless men, illustrating, I believe, the view that this element does not rise or fall, but is there in the cauldron of story, waiting for the great figures of myth and history, and for the yet nameless he or she, waiting for the moment when they are cast into the simmering stew, one by one or all together, without consideration of rank or precedence. Tolkien drew The Lord of the Rings up out of that simmering stew, and it was back into the pot that his characters were cast. He sparked the modern fantasy genre, and almost all fantasy literature that has been written since the publication of The Lord of the Rings has been scooping out and reusing, repurposing, or completely inverting those original characters and tropes that Tolkien wrote, just in the way that Tolkien did with Arthurian legend. In a letter, Tolkien explained that when he first started work on Middle-earth, he had lofty aspirations of creating a new mythos for England. Of course, he then remarks that this was a largely futile endeavor, but I think he was being a little too hard on himself here. The Lord of the Rings may not have created a new national mythology for England, but it did lay the groundwork for the explosion of fantasy that we've seen over the past 50 years. It is intentional fantasy. It is fantasy that dives back through the characters, tropes, and stories of the last 2, 3, 4,000 years and reinvents them, lambasts them, recreates these stories in incredibly new and inventive and beautiful ways. Tolkien awoke a species-wide hunger to escape, to imagine our past and our future in new and creative ways. And I do think it's fair to say that part of the reason he was able to take that leap was because of the imaginative freedom that artists, authors, and storytellers have always found in the great King Arthur. I'll be honest, as much as I did just write, a 20 or 30 minute video about the Arthurian myths, I've never been super huge on them. My biggest interaction with them was probably the far too many times that I watched Monty Python and the Holy Grail as a kid. But I would like to get more into them, so if you have any suggestions for Arthurian retellings or spin-offs, please let me know in the comments. Now, I feel that I have made all of you wait long enough, so we are going to go ahead and cut to Jess in another outfit for a very special announcement. So in honor of Hobbit Day, that's Bilbo Baggins' birthday, coming up this weekend on the 22nd, I am very excited to announce that we now have art for the channel, created by my incredible best friend, Bridget. First off, we have a couple of generic, non-copyrightable round doors, including a very cute brand new channel logo, and then we have my favorites, which are the Hobbit rats. And then she has also made one drawing each for each of the pairs of pet rats that I've had. We've got Leo and Bertram, we have Agnar and Osmond, we have Godfrey and Hamburglar Sam, and we have Ignatius and Theo. And from this art, we have had stickers made. A whole bunch of stickers. And these stickers will be available on the new top tier of my Patreon. That'll be a $10 tier. And with that, when you sign up for it, you get all of the other perks, as well as I will send you by hand with my own hands with a cute little card and everything, these 3 main stickers, as well as one each of these guys. It'll be a random luck of the draw, unless I guess you have a very specific request, but yeah, so it'll be a little surprise which of these 4 guys you're gonna get. But yeah, you get stickers when you sign up, and they're really high quality, they're vinyl, they're dishwasher safe, and I'm super excited about this. Now, I will say that if I were you, I would probably sign up for this $10 tier and then either downgrade to one of the other tiers or get off the Patreon entirely. Honestly, just that 1 month of the $10, I am happy to send these to you, and you're supporting me so much with that. Now, although I am announcing this on Hobbit Day, these stickers and the card and everything still stands from now until the end of time, as far as I'm concerned. So if you want to check out my Patreon, that's linked below, and I really, really appreciate you guys and the community that we've built here. And if you have any more questions about how any of this is going to work, feel free to check out my Patreon, where I have way more details, or message me. Now, as always, if you are not in a financial place to be able to support me on Patreon, do not worry about it. Watching these videos is plenty support enough, and I really appreciate you being here. Thank you all so much. I am so excited about these guys. They are everything I could have asked for. And let's get back to other Jess. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it or if you learned something, and consider subscribing if you want to come back every week to hear me blab on about storytelling, Tolkien, and any other stuff I want to talk about. Thank you so much for joining me this week, and I hope that you have a very happy, hobbity day.